Montana Territory, October 1887, the wind came down sharp from the crazy mountains that morning, slicing through the cottonwoods along the Yellowstone River. The ground was hard with frost, the grass brittle under boots, and the sky above was the kind of pale blue that promised a bitter night ahead. Zachary Vance had one hand resting on the butt of his rifle, the other steadying his gelding as he watched faint smoke rise in the distance. He knew that land knew it better than his own scarred hands. It was the Bartley place, and no one was supposed to be living there anymore. He nudged the horse forward, jaw tight. That land had been empty since the widow and her 2 children disappeared last spring, abandoned, the sheriff said. Left without a word. Zachary had never believed it. A mother does not walk away from her children. Something had gone wrong. By the time he reached the house, he had his rifle unslung. But what met him wasn't danger. It was her, Olive Bartley, standing on the porch with her sleeves rolled up and a shotgun across her arms, her eyes narrowed but steady. Her dark brown hair was pinned up, though loose strands clung to her cheek in the wind. Behind her, through the open door, came the sound of a child's cough. Zachary lowered his rifle. "Olive," she didn't move, "you should not be here. I could say the same about you. Folks thought you were gone for good." "I was not gone, I was hiding." Zachary stepped off his horse, slow and careful. From who, before she could answer, a small voice called out from inside the house. "Mama, inside, Clara," she said quickly. "Keep your brother warm." She looked back at Zachary, her shoulders tight. "I do not want trouble," he stared at her. "You have 2 children in there?" "Yes. You need help. I need to be left alone." But Zachary wasn't backing down. He knew Olive. Had known her since they were children, back when she was too bold for her own good and he was too quiet to speak his mind. He had watched her marry young, watched her husband drink himself to ruin, watched the bruises she never talked about. And now she stood in front of him with that same fire in her eyes, guarding her children like a she-wolf. "You disappeared, Olive," he said. "The sheriff searched for you, thought maybe you had not made it." "I made it," she said. "Barely." He looked past her into the house. "Let me help," she hesitated. "You were always kind to me." "I still am." Finally, she stepped aside. "Come in, but just for a minute." The inside of the cabin was cold but clean. 2 children sat near the hearth, wrapped in blankets. Clara, maybe 6 years old, had her mother's dark eyes. The boy, younger, sat curled against her, his small chest rattling with every breath. Zachary crouched beside them. "What is his name?" "Caleb," Olive said softly. Zachary touched the boy's forehead. "He has fever, I know. You have anything for it, just willow bark." "And prayers." Zachary stood. "He needs more than that." "I cannot go into town, they will find us." Zachary looked at her. "Who is they?" She swallowed hard. "My husband's brothers. When he died, they came looking for what was his. They think I am hiding something, money, land, something. They do not care about the children. They said they would take them to teach me a lesson." Zachary's jaw clenched. "They tried," she nodded. "That is why we left." "Why come back here?" "No one would expect it, and I did not know where else to go." She looked away. "I thought maybe I could fix up the house, hunt enough to last the winter." Zachary looked at the thin walls, the half-rotted roofline. "You will not last a week once the snow hits. Then we will move again. With a sick child and 2 men hunting you," her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. "It is my burden." "No," Zachary said. "It is not." She stared at him. "Why are you doing this?" "Because someone should." "And because I never forgot you." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Zachary looked at the children again. "I can take you all to my place. It is up in the hills back behind the tree line. No one comes that way unless they are invited. I cannot ask, you didn't ask." "I offered." That night, with Caleb wrapped in blankets and lying across Zachary's saddle, they rode through the dark. Clara clung to her mother, silent and wide-eyed. Olive did not speak much either, but when she looked over at Zachary, he felt something shift, not just in her, in him too. He had been alone for a long time, by choice, by habit. But now, with the weight of the boy in his arms and Olive riding beside him, that old quiet life felt distant. The cabin came into view just before midnight. It was small but sturdy. Zachary helped Olive down, then carried Caleb inside. He laid the boy near the fire, then looked back at Olive. "You and Clara take the bed, I will stay close." She nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Thank you, Zachary," he paused. "You do not have to thank me, I want to do this." She looked at him, her voice soft. "Why?" He hesitated, then said, "Because you matter to me." She did not answer, just watched him with something unreadable in her eyes. The next morning, Caleb's fever broke. Zachary sat outside chopping wood when she stepped onto the porch. She had her arms crossed, her hair down around her face. "He is better," she said. "I figured. He was sleeping sound when I checked." "I do not know how to thank you. You already did." She stepped forward. "I meant what I said. I was not expecting help. I was ready to fight alone. I know. But I am tired, and I do not want to run anymore." Zachary set the axe down, then stopped running. She looked out at the trees, then back at him. "Do you really want us here?" "Yes, I do." Her voice broke slightly. "Even with the trouble I bring," he stepped closer. "Even with that." She looked up at him, then nodded once. "All right." That night they sat by the fire after the children had gone to sleep. Olive pressed a mug of tea into his hands and sat beside him. "You always were the good one," she said. He smiled faintly. "You used to say I was boring." "I was wrong." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Then softly she said, "I never forgot you either." Zachary turned to her, something warm blooming in his chest. "Olive." She reached out, her fingers brushing his. "I am not ready for anything more," she said. "But I am not afraid anymore, not with you." Zachary nodded. "That is enough." And for now it was. The snow came early that year. By the second week of November, the hills behind Zachary's cabin wore a thick coat of white, and the wind had taken on a low, constant moan that slipped through the trees like a warning. Inside, the hearth stayed lit from morning to night. Fed with pine and spruce, Zachary had split before the first flurries settled. The children stayed bundled together near the fire, their cheeks flushed with health now, though Caleb's cough returned when the air turned damp. Zachary built a second cot from pine boards and canvas so Clara wouldn't have to sleep curled at her mother's side on the too small bed. He didn't ask permission. He just made it, set it near the fire, and told Clara it was hers. She had watched him without speaking, then climbed into it that night with her doll tucked to her chest and fell asleep without protest. Olive noticed. She noticed everything. "You built that with your own hands," she said one evening, her gaze following the lines of the cot. "You've been working from sunup just to keep this place holding together." Zachary kept his eyes on the fire as he adjusted a pot of beans. "It's the sort of work I know how to do." "Still," she said, wrapping her shawl closer, "you didn't have to." He stirred the pot once, then looked over. "I wanted to." She didn't answer, just watched him with that quiet consideration he was still learning to read. The days fell into rhythm. Zachary hunted when the snow lightened, bringing back hare once a young buck. Olive salted and dried what they didn't eat, hanging strips of meat from hooks strung along the rafters. She found a root cellar half buried behind the cabin, and together they cleared it of frost and debris so she could store what little they had. Each chore turned into a lesson. Clara learned to sweep the hearth and bank the fire. Caleb, still too young to contribute much, followed Zachary around with slow steps, pointing and asking questions in a voice rasped from weeks of illness. He wanted to know what the trap lines were for, how the water got from the spring to the bucket, whether the deer could smell him from where he stood. Zachary answered every question, patient as stone. One morning, as Zachary returned from checking snares, frost white on his beard and a dead fox hanging from his belt, he found Olive kneeling beside the hearth, her hands red from washing linens in melted snow. She was humming something low, a sound that wove through the room like thread. He paused in the doorway. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on wringing out the cloth, her brow furrowed. "You used to sing that when you were younger," he said. She looked up, startled, then flushed and stood. "I didn't know I remembered it." Zachary stepped inside, shutting out the cold. Your mother used to hum it when she baked. I haven't thought of that in years. She folded the cloth over a chair back. Funny how things stay in the body even when the mind forgets. He set the fox down by the door. That's the way memory works, I suppose. She looked down at her hands. I used to think I'd lost everything. That there wasn't a part of me left that hadn't been broken or burned through. You haven't lost anything that matters. Her voice was quiet. I'm not so sure. Zachary stepped closer, not touching her, just standing near enough that she could feel the warmth he carried in from the outside. You've kept your children safe. You've kept yourself standing. That's more than most. She didn't speak, but her shoulders eased a little. Later that day, a pair of snowshoes were left by the cabin wall. Zachary had made them from bent willow and rawhide. When Olive asked what they were for, he said, "In case you ever want to walk farther than the yard." She tried them the next morning. Zachary helped her fasten the bindings, then walked beside her through the trees, their steps quiet against the crusted snow. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It had grown into something steady. They reached a ridge that overlooked the valley, the river below frozen in long gray sheets. Olive stood beside him, her breath curling in the air. I forgot how far the world goes, she said. He looked at her profile, the faint color high in her cheeks, the steady line of her jaw. It's still all here, just waiting. She didn't look at him when she spoke next. I had dreams once, he waited. I wanted to teach. I could read and write better than most, and I thought maybe there'd be a place for me in some town. A small school, maybe. I used to imagine standing at a chalkboard with my apron dusted in white. Zachary didn't laugh. You would have been good at it. I never told anyone that before. You still can, she glanced at him. It's too late for that. No, he said. It's not. They walked back in silence, the sun dipping low behind the trees. That night, after the children were asleep, Olive sat at the table with a bit of charcoal and a scrap of paper he'd found among old supplies. She wrote out the alphabet in careful strokes, then numbers, then a short verse from memory. Her handwriting was steady, precise. Zachary watched from the hearth. You've still got it, she smiled without looking up. I never stopped knowing how, I just stopped believing it mattered. It matters. She looked over, her face soft in the firelight. You make it feel that way. The next week brought another storm. They barely left the cabin. Zachary reinforced the roof with extra sheeting, and Olive boiled down the last bones into broth. When Zachary brought in a half-frozen grouse one afternoon, she took it with both hands and said, "This will last us 3 days if I stretch it right." He nodded. "I'll try for more when the storm eases." That night, with the wind screaming outside and the fire burning low, Olive moved her cot closer to the hearth. She tugged Clara's blanket higher, then sat on the floor beside Caleb's sleeping form. Zachary watched her for a long time before he spoke. You haven't said much today, she pulled her shawl tighter. I've been thinking about, she looked up at him. About how quiet it is now, not just the storm. Inside me, I don't feel hunted anymore. He didn't speak. She stood slowly, walked over and sat beside him. You gave us that. I just gave you shelter. No, she said. You gave us safety, that's not the same. They sat that way for a long while, the fire casting shadows across the walls. Eventually, she said, I used to think I'd never trust a man again, not with anything. Not even a word. Zachary's voice was low. You don't have to. I want to. He looked at her. Are you sure? She nodded. Yes. He didn't reach for her, didn't move closer, but his hand shifted just slightly, palm up between them. She laid her fingers over his. They stayed that way until the fire died down to coals, and the storm outside softened to a whisper. By morning, the sky had cleared. The world outside lay untouched, a field of white stretching toward the trees. It was Olive who opened the door first. She stepped out into the cold, head high, her breath rising in bright clouds. Zachary followed, standing beside her. They'll come looking again eventually, she said. I know. But they won't find us. No, she turned to him. Because you'll make sure of it. I will, she stepped closer. And you'll stay? Yes. She touched the collar of his coat, her fingers brushing the wool. "Then I'm not afraid of what comes," he looked at her. "Neither am I," and for the first time in years she believed it. The first time the Cheyenne man came to the cabin, it was just after the thaw began. The snow had softened into slush that clung to boots and soaked through the seams of Zachary's coat. He had gone to check the traps beyond the north ridge and returned with a brace of rabbits and an uneasy feeling under his ribs. He found the tracks before he reached the porch, narrow moccasin prints, deliberate and light, not made in fear or haste. Inside, Olive knelt by the hearth, feeding dried sage and pine needles into the fire. Clara was stringing beads from a pouch she'd found in the loft, and Caleb was asleep with his head in her lap. The door was unbarred. They hadn't heard him approach. Zachary set the rabbits down beside the door and stepped inside. "Someone's been here." Olive turned sharply. "What do you mean?" "Tracks. One set. They came from the east tree line." She stood slowly, her eyes scanning past him. "You think it was one of them?" "No," he said. "Too light. Too careful, someone who knows how to move quiet." She didn't ask how he could tell. In the weeks since she'd come to his cabin, she'd learned that when Zachary said something, it was because he was sure. That night, he sat by the door with his rifle across his knees until dawn. Nothing came. 3 days later, the Cheyenne came back. Zachary was chopping wood behind the cabin when he heard the soft call of a bird, 3 notes, low and even. Not the sound of any bird he knew. He turned and saw him at the edge of the trees, shoulders wrapped in a faded wool blanket, a single braid hanging over his left shoulder, the rest of his hair loose and lifted by the wind. He didn't carry a weapon. Zachary set the axe down and approached slowly, stopping a decent distance away. "You watching us?" The man nodded once. "I saw a woman and children. I thought they might be hungry." He reached inside the folds of his blanket and pulled out a bundle wrapped in deer hide. Inside was a smoked elk heart, dried corn, and a small pouch of ground acorns. Zachary didn't move. "Why?" The man's gaze didn't shift. "Because I remember what it is to be starving." Zachary considered him a long moment. "Your name?" "Walks with Night." "Zachary." They stood in silence, the wind stirring between them. "I won't take what I can't repay," Zachary said. "Then feed them," Walks with Night answered. "That is enough." He turned and walked back into the trees. Olive listened without speaking when Zachary told her. She took the elk heart in both hands and rinsed it in snowmelt before cooking it with dried herbs. The children ate in silence, their eyes wide. That night, Olive sat by the fire longer than usual, her sewing forgotten in her lap. "Do you trust him?" she asked. "I trust he means what he said." She nodded once, her face unreadable. "Then we'll accept it." 2 more weeks passed before they saw him again. This time he came at dusk, walking openly into the clearing, his arms empty. Zachary met him halfway and offered him a place by the fire. Walks with Night accepted without hesitation, lowering himself cross-legged onto the packed earth floor. Clara handed him a cup of warm broth without looking directly at him, and he took it with a nod. Olive sat across from him, her hands resting in her lap. "You're Cheyenne?" "Yes," she hesitated. "You've been watching our cabin." "I have." "Why?" He looked at her directly. "Because I lost my wife last winter and my daughter the year before. I have nothing left I must protect, so I watch and I help where I can." Olive's mouth tightened. "You came alone." "I come alone now. I was not always alone." The fire popped softly between them. Zachary sat near the hearth, one leg stretched out, his eyes steady on the man who had brought them food when their stores had run low. "You live nearby?" Walks with Night nodded. "A few days walk west. I built a shelter near the old buffalo trails." "You're not with a band anymore?" Olive asked. "No," he said. "I left when the sickness came. I buried my family myself. Too many others were gone to help." Olive's voice was soft. "I'm sorry." He inclined his head, then looked at her with calm candor. "You are not Cheyenne, but you carry grief the same way." She didn't flinch. "My husband died last year, and then his brothers came. We fled." Walks with Night did not offer pity, only silence. That night after he left, Olive didn't speak until the fire burned low. "He's not like the others I've known." "No," Zachary said, "he isn't." Over the next weeks, walks with Night came and went. He never stayed long. Sometimes he brought dried meat or small trinkets for the children, a carved bone whistle, a pouch of sweet-smelling cedar. Once he brought Olive a length of woven reed cord, saying only that it might help bind up the roof when the next storm came. Caleb followed him around the yard whenever he visited, asking endless questions. Walks with Night answered with patience, teaching him how to tell direction by moss on the trees, how to remain still long enough for birds to return. One afternoon, as Zachary repaired a fence post near the lower slope, Olive approached where Walks with Night was teaching Clara how to twist fibers into string. "You said you help where you can," she said. He nodded. "Why us?" He looked at her hands before meeting her eyes. "Because you are not broken, even after all that's been taken, and that matters." She stood quietly beside him, her hands tightening on her shawl. "I've spent too long remembering what I lost," he said. "It eases something in me to give." She studied him. "You don't expect anything in return?" "No." That evening after he left, Olive stood on the porch as the sun bled down through the trees. Zachary came up behind her, wiping his hands on a rag. "You all right?" He's given more than he had to. That's the kind of man he is. Olive turned to him. "So are you?" Zachary didn't answer. He didn't need to. She leaned her shoulder lightly against his, and they stood that way until the cold drove them inside. Spring came slow but steady. Buds curled on the branches, and the creek behind the cabin filled with meltwater. Zachary built a small coop for the pair of hens a trapper had traded him, and Olive cleared a patch of earth for planting. She showed Clara how to press seeds into the soil, her voice low and sure. One evening, while the children slept, Olive brought a small wood box to the table. She set it down before Zachary and opened it to reveal a ring, simple and narrow, the band etched with tiny grooves. "My mother's," she said. "I've kept it all these years." Zachary looked at her. "I don't have fine words," she said. "But I know what I want." He reached out, his hand closing over hers. "So do I." She gave him the ring. They didn't speak of promises they didn't need to. Everything between them had been earned inch by inch, through silence and storm and the long, slow work of trust. Later that night, as the last of the firelight flickered across the walls, Olive rested beside him, her hand curled over his. Outside, the wind carried the scent of thawing earth. They had made it through the winter. Together. By late May, the wind no longer cut with ice, and the cabin walls no longer groaned at night. The thaw came in slow drips from the eaves, the earth giving a low sigh as it softened underfoot. The scent of pine needles warming in the sun drifted through the clearing, and the stream behind the cabin ran swift and clear again. Zachary had finished repairing the fence along the western edge of the property, where the snowfall had crushed the posts flat. Olive had taken to waking early, often before dawn, to kneel in the garden patch with her hands buried in the soil. She hummed while she worked, not the old tune from winter, but something slower, unshaped, her own. Clara stayed close to her, learning the feel of the dirt, while Caleb followed Zachary into the woods more often now, steady on his feet and full of quiet questions. One morning, Walks with Night came from the northeast trail, a woven pouch slung over his shoulder. Zachary spotted him before he reached the clearing and raised a hand. Walks with Night returned the gesture and waited at the edge of the yard. "Something's wrong," he said once Zachary reached him. Zachary kept his voice even. "Who?" "A man rode past my shelter 2 days ago." He was asking questions. White man, dirty coat, big hands, wore a knife at the hip. Zachary's mouth drew tight. "Did he say a name?" He said he was looking for a woman with 2 children, said his kin had been cheated. "Was he alone?" "Yes." "But I don't believe he will stay that way." Zachary glanced back toward the cabin where Olive knelt with a basket of greens in her lap. He turned again to Walks with Night. "You think he's close?" "Not yet. But he was headed toward the old cattle trail." "He'll find this place eventually." Zachary nodded once. "Thank you." Walks with Night set the pouch down. I brought dried roots for the child's cough. Zachary took the bundle. You've done more than we could ever repay. Walks with Night didn't respond to that. Instead, he looked toward the cabin again. She's stronger now. She's never been anything else, Zachary said. Walks with Night touched the braid over his shoulder briefly. If you need me, leave a mark on the pine east of the ridge. I'll come when I can. Zachary gripped his hand. I won't forget it. That night, Zachary told Olive what had been said. She didn't flinch, but her fingers closed around the edge of the table. It was only a matter of time, she said. We'll be ready. She stood. I'm not running again. I wouldn't ask you to. She crossed the room and placed her hand against his chest, over the place where his shirt hung open at the collar. If they come, they won't find the same woman they chased off last time. He covered her hand with his. They won't touch you. Not while I draw breath. The next morning, Zachary took Caleb with him to reset the traps and showed him how to knot a snare with careful hands. He didn't speak of danger, only showed the boy how to move quiet, how to listen for the wrong kind of silence in the woods. Caleb watched with wide eyes, mimicking each motion until his fingers stopped fumbling. Olive stayed near the cabin with Clara, reinforcing the garden fence with willow branch weavings and teaching her how to tell the difference between pigweed and young spinach. She didn't speak of fear either, only of growth and patience. 3 days passed without sign. On the 4th, as dusk fell, Zachary spotted smoke curling from the southern ridge, too far to be a fire of their own making. He saddled his horse before the light faded completely and rode out to investigate. When he returned past midnight, his jaw was set hard. One man, he said. Camped alone for now, but he's circling, watching, waiting. Olive didn't pale. Then we do the same. The next morning, she packed a small bag with dried apples and a flint striker and tucked it beneath the hearthstones. She showed Clara where it was. Only if you must, she said. Zachary sharpened his rifle sights and laid a second shotgun within reach over the mantel. He didn't speak of what would happen if the man rode in. That was understood. But the man didn't come not for days. When he did, it was just after sunrise, and he did it with the arrogance of someone who believed himself unchallenged. He rode into the yard on a roan gelding, his coat stiff with old sweat and his boots crusted with mud. He had the knife at his hip, just as Walks with Night described, and a pistol tucked behind. Zachary met him before he reached the porch. State your business, Zachary said. The man reined in. Looking for someone, name's Olive Bartley. Zachary didn't shift. You won't find her here. The man smiled, slow and humorless. Funny, I was told different. Zachary's stance didn't falter. You were told wrong. The man leaned forward in the saddle. She took something that wasn't hers. Behind him, Olive stepped out of the cabin, Clara at her side. She didn't raise her voice. I took my children and my life back, nothing else. The man turned in his saddle, surprise flickering across his face for a moment, then it soured. You think hiding in the trees makes you safe? Zachary didn't move, but his voice dropped into something harder. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. The man looked between them, then at the tree line. He didn't see anyone. But a hawk called from the ridge and something in his posture shifted. He didn't dismount. I'll be back, he said, turning his horse. Zachary didn't raise the rifle, though he could have. He watched the man disappear down the trail, then turned to Olive. We won't wait for him to come with others. That night they packed what they needed. Zachary led them west, through the narrow deer paths Walks with Night had shown him weeks before. They moved quiet, the children wrapped in thick coats, their steps careful. They reached the old buffalo trail by morning, and by midday they saw the thin curl of smoke rising from Walks with Night's shelter. He met them without surprise, stepping from behind a cluster of birch trees with his bow slung across his back. You were followed. No, Zachary said. But he'll come again, and not alone. Walks with Night led them down into the stone-dappled hollow where his lodge stood half-built into the side of a hill. The entrance was narrow, but the space inside was dry and warm, lined with firs and cedar branches. He had dug channels into the floor for runoff and built a smoking rack above the fire pit. "You'll stay here until it's done," he said. Zachary nodded once. For 3 days they stayed close to the lodge. Walks with Night brought news through trails only he traveled. 2 men had joined the one from before. They'd camped near the burned-out mill, asking questions, flashing coin, but no one had seen the Bartley woman. "They'll give up," Walks with Night said. "They don't know these woods." Zachary looked toward the ridge. "And if they don't, then I'll see them first." On the 4th morning, Walks with Night returned with a torn scrap of canvas in hand. "They're leaving," he said. "They've run out of food and patience." Zachary looked at Olive. Her shoulders dropped just a little. They returned to the cabin 2 days later. Nothing had been touched. The garden had taken root and the hens clucked in the coop, unbothered. Spring had settled in earnest. That night, with the children asleep and the fire burning low, Olive unwrapped a bundle of cloth and drew out the ring Zachary had given her. "I want to marry before the summer ends," she said. "Not because we have to or because it's expected, but because I choose you." Zachary didn't hesitate. "Then we'll marry here, with the trees as witness." She pressed the ring into his hand again. He didn't need to say anything more. He placed the ring on her finger, and her hand stayed in his long after the fire burned down to embers. By early June, the valley had shifted into full bloom. Wild roses climbed the slope behind the cabin, their pale petals catching in the breeze like scraps of silk. The creek swelled with meltwater from the high ridges, and the garden, now thick with young greens, held the scent of damp soil and growing things. Each morning brought a new color to the hills: lupine, yarrow, Indian paintbrush. The long winter had passed for good. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows in long, golden stripes, warming the floorboards where Clara sat stitching a patch onto her dress. She had learned to thread her own needle, though she still asked Olive to knot the thread for her when her fingers got tired. Caleb was outside, balanced on a flat stone near the coop, counting aloud the growing number of eggs they'd started collecting. Zachary carved a length of pine on the cabin's front step, whittling it smooth and narrow. He hadn't said what it was yet, only that it was for Clara. She didn't ask, but she watched him with open curiosity, her head tilted like she was reading a book she couldn't quite understand. Olive stood at the edge of the garden, brushing loose dirt from her hands. Her hair was tied back with a strip of blue cotton she'd cut from one of her old skirts, and the sun lit the curve of her cheekbone in a way that made Zachary pause in his carving. He watched her pull weeds with calm precision, her movements practiced. There was strength in the way she held herself, now quiet, certain, steady. She looked up and met his eyes. "You're watching me again. I like the view." She shook her head, but her mouth tugged at the corners. "You haven't told her what you're making. She'll know when I'm finished. You always do that. Keep your plans tucked close." He set down the carving knife. "I used to live quiet because it was easier than explaining myself. Now I live quiet because I want to listen." "To what?" He stood, brushing sawdust from his trousers. "To the way you breathe when you're asleep, to the sound the wind makes when it moves through the cottonwoods, to what matters." She stepped toward him, her eyes soft. "I never knew that kind of quiet before." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. "You've got it now." That afternoon, Walks with Night arrived without ceremony, stepping from the trees as if he'd always belonged in the space between the garden and the woodpile. He carried a bundle wrapped in deerskin, tied with a strip of sinew. In it were dried berries, a length of buffalo hide, and a carved bone comb for Clara. "I came to say goodbye," he said. Zachary folded his arms. "You heading west?" Walks with Night nodded. "There's a trader near the Wind River who owes me something old. I thought I'd go and collect it while the weather's good." Olive came forward. "Will you return?" He looked at her, his face unreadable. "I never return to the same place twice." "But I remember what I leave behind." She stepped closer. "You've done more for us than anyone had a right to." "I gave what I had," he said. "You did the rest." Clara came out holding the comb, her small fingers exploring the ridged design. "It's beautiful." Walks with Night crouched beside her. "It belonged to my wife once," She would have liked you." Clara didn't answer, but she reached out and touched his braid with the lightest of fingers. Then she nodded as if she understood something too deep for words. He stood, looked once at each of them, then disappeared into the trees. They did not see him again. The days stretched longer. Zachary finished the pine carving and handed it to Clara without preamble. It was a flute, smooth and light, with 6 carved holes and a band of knotted horsehair at the base. She held it like it was something precious, then lifted it to her lips. The sound she made wasn't clear, but she grinned like it didn't matter. Olive's eyes shone as she watched her daughter try again. That night, after the children were asleep, Olive opened the tin box where she'd kept her mother's ring and placed it carefully on the table between them. Zachary reached for it without speaking, then slipped it onto her finger again, but this time in the hush of shared certainty. "We'll have the vows in July," she said. "I want the roses blooming," he nodded. "We'll ask the preacher in Bridger, he comes through every 3rd Sunday. I want Clara and Caleb with us, and I want to wear blue. I'll build you a frame for the altar, something simple." She leaned into him. "Everything simple with you turns out beautiful." By mid-July, the roses behind the cabin were in full bloom, their petals pale and open beneath the sun. The preacher arrived in a wagon pulled by a swayback mule, his collar crooked and his boots dusty. He didn't ask questions. Only looked between the two of them and said, "You ready?" They were. Zachary wore a clean shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Olive stood barefoot in the grass, her blue dress clean and pressed, her hair braided down her back with a single ribbon at the end. Clara held Caleb's hand, both standing beside their mother. The altar frame Zachary built stood behind them, rough-hewn and draped with pine boughs and wildflowers Olive and Clara had gathered that morning. They spoke their vows under the wide Montana sky, with the wind moving gently through the trees and the creek singing behind them. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary kissed her with both hands on her face, and Olive wrapped her arms around him like she'd found the one place she could finally rest. They ate cornbread, jerked venison, and sweetened berries. Caleb fell asleep in Olive's lap before the sun dipped behind the ridge. Clara played a tune on her flute, only a few notes, but clear and sure. Later, as dusk settled and the stars began to appear, Olive and Zachary sat on the porch, their shoulders pressed together, the children asleep inside. "I never thought peace would feel like this," she said. "Like a place that fits around you instead of something you have to chase." He reached for her hand, interlacing their fingers. "We built it. No one gave it to us." She turned to him, her voice low. "I want to grow old here. I want to wake up beside you every morning with your hair tangled, and your face sunburnt and your hands rough. I want to plant more than we need and give the rest to anyone who passes through. I want to teach Clara how to read poetry and Caleb how to skin a deer, and I want to do it all beside you." He leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. "You got it, Olive, all of it." The stars wheeled overhead and the night deepened around them. Years passed. The cabin became more than shelter. It became a home. Zachary added a second room when Caleb outgrew his cot, and Olive taught school to 4 children from nearby homesteads during the colder months. She made chalk from crushed limestone and shaped slates from river stone, and she taught each child to read the way she'd once dreamed of as if it were salvation. Clara grew into her mother's quiet strength, her hands always busy, her eyes always searching the sky. Caleb became fearless in the woods, often ranging farther than anyone expected, but always returning before the sun dipped too low. He carved his own flute by the time he was 9, and when he played it, even the birds seemed to pause. Walks with night never returned, but Olive hung his comb beside the hearth on a string of leather cord. She told the children his name without embellishment, and they never forgot it. Zachary and Olive never left the valley. They had no reason to. Every spring, the wild roses bloomed behind the cabin. Every winter, Zachary cut enough wood to see them through, and Olive dried herbs in bundles above the hearth. Their life was not without work or worry or the ache of old wounds, but it was full. And it was theirs. On their 10th anniversary, Zachary carved a bench from the cedar that had fallen during a storm the year before. He placed it beneath the tallest pine near the creek, and on warm evenings, he and Olive sat on it with their hands joined and their knees touching. She never stopped humming while she worked. He never tired of the sound, and together they watched the world grow around them, quiet, steady, whole.